So my lecture this morning is going to have 5 different parts to it, and we're going to make our way through about 152 years of history in about 45 minutes. So buckle up. But what I'd first like to do, even though we are out in the middle of Dundee, if I might just open with a word of prayer, because that's what they always used to do anytime something happened in Dundee back in the olden days. Lord God, Heavenly Father, we thank and praise you for our village. We thank and praise you for the men and women who not only serve us, but lead us. And we ask that you would continue to raise up men and women to be visionaries as well as caretakers of what we have and of what we will yet be. And Lord, we give you thanks for each other, for this town, for our churches, but most especially for your grace and love and forgiveness that comes through Jesus Christ, our Savior. In his name we pray. Amen. So 5 parts, I said. There's going to be 5 parts. The first part is just a little broad history of why Immanuel, East Dundee. The first part is called The Preparation Years, Finding a Foothold for the Faith. And it's really from the beginning of the 1800s up through the 1860s. Real quick. In the 1830s, there was a notable family known as the Oatmans. And they were one of the largest land-owning families in the whole Fox Valley area. And it was the Oatman family that first established themselves by building a tavern. And then they built a general store. And where the Elgin Federal Bank used to be, it's now a vacant building up there. And then over kind of where the car fix-it shops are on the north side of the street there, but just east a little bit of us, not all the way to 25, of course, between us and 25. That was pretty much where the Oatman store and tavern was. And then they discovered that there were fresh springs of water underneath. And they started taking advantage of that. In fact, they started calling this area Spring Hill. Where have you heard that before? Well, there was a monopoly on the tavern, and there was a fellow by the name of David Hammer. And he did not like it that the Oatmans were making all the money and enlarging their land holdings. And so he built a competitive tavern that was very, very successful. And that very site would be located today on the southwest corner of Main Street and Van Buren, where Immanuel, East Dundee stands today. The very place our church has stood since 1886 is when the church first was built. But first, it wasn't the first building there. It was actually a tavern. How did we get our name of Dundee? Now that's a great, great story too. So when they were building the Oatman house, so the Oatmans were going to build this huge monstrosity of a mansion. And they invited the townspeople to come and do a house raising. And one of the ways they got the men to come to do the house raising and the women to do all the cooking and the sewing at that time is they said they would have a drawing, and whoever won the drawing would be able to name the village. A man by the name of David Garainer, he was a Scotsman of all things, and he was able to win the drawing, and it was Garainer who then said he wanted to name this new town after his hometown back in Scotland, which was known as Dundee on the Firth of Tay. Firth, Tay. I have no idea what those names mean. But it was Dundee on the Firth of Tay. That was too long of a name for we Americans, and so originally it was just known as Dundee, and this was about the late 1830s. Interesting fact. After the taverns were established and the general store, and Dundee was named, the town's fathers then petitioned the United States government to receive a post office. They were granted, in 1836, they were granted the right to open the United States Post Office in Dundee. Here's what's really interesting. A year later, Elgin, Illinois, petitioned for a United States Post Office, and they were denied because they were too close to Dundee. And the postal people said it will never be as successful of a town as Dundee is going to be. So we got our post office first. They were able to secure one about 5 years later. Now, those of us who come from German Lutheran extraction, we were actually latecomers to the Dundee area. In terms of people of faith, really the first people that came were the Methodists. And then came the Baptists. And after the Baptists came the Congregationalists. And of course, First Congregational Church in Dundee. They were some of the early pioneers here. Then came the Episcopalians. And then came the Presbyterians. And then came the Mormons and the Spiritists. But the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists, all those folks didn't like the Mormons, so they kicked them out, and there's no Mormon church around here. When the German Lutherans finally did come, they tried to establish, first of all, a school, and then a place to worship. But there was not a lot of theological integrity. In fact, the history records that there were many charlatans, wolves in sheep's clothing, who did not come to worship Jesus and to evangelize for Jesus. What they really came to do was to bilk people out of their measly little bits of money or their huge inheritances, depending on what their station was. That brings us up to about the 1860s. One of the more notable things that was happening in Dundee, though, is at first, each of the groups of people were segregated by their denomination. The Lutherans hung with the Lutherans, the Presbyterians hung with the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians hung with the Episcopalians. But then a phenomena happened. And it started allowing people to enjoy the peoples of other denominations. They started having town dances. They would have two fiddlers, one on one side of the room and one on the other side, and they would have barn dances and square dances. And all of a sudden, the Lutherans started realizing that those Methodists could dance, and the Episcopalians kind of liked how them Presbyterians would twirl. And all of a sudden, the town started coming together around dances. It would not be untrue to say our Dundee started and grew because of taverns and dancing. With that said, it is then in 1862 the congregation of Immanuel Lutheran of East Dundee is formed. The early years, groaning and growing. We'll say from 1861-ish to 1929. It was during the Civil War, from 1860 to 1864, that the German immigrants who came across into Dundee established a congregation. Now, they had tried literally since the early 1850s to establish one, and they had these circuit riders, pastors that would try to start, but every time they try to start one, there would be these huge fallouts, big fights, and they would unmask these charlatans. They were drunkards, they were scoundrels, they were cheats and thieves and pickpockets even. Or there was a pastor who was kicked out of Dundee because he was a pickpocket. And so that doesn't bode well for us pastors, I know. But so literally for about 10, 12 years, they tried to establish a congregation, but it was in 1862 when the congregation firmly was established. The church then, that you can see the steeple right there, was then built in 1886. It took a long time for the congregation to be able to build a church. They did worship in other spots, but to have the church that we have today, it took a long time. Now, the congregation, 1862, but in 1873, they built a school. Interesting, Immanuel Dundee loves its school and has from its history, because the folks thought a school was so important that they built a school 13 years before they would even build a sanctuary. It was more important to educate the children. And that's really the history of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is our national organization. When the Saxon Lutherans came up the Mississippi River after they came over from Germany, and they landed in Perry County, Missouri, the first thing they did was establish a seminary, a school for pastors. Even before they started churches, they established a school. We are an educational-based denomination, and we will continue to be. In fact, our school continues to be a hallmark of our ministry. Excuse me. So in 1873, the first school was built. Interesting enough, that building still stands today. If you go up to the corner of Jackson and Van Buren, on the northwest corner, there is an apartment building there, and that is the original school first built in 1873. A second school was built, one as an addition to the first school, not to replace it, but as an addition because the school was growing so much. And that second school was then built about 3 or 4 years later, and that building stands today too. In fact, it is on Main Street. It is the Dundee Music Store. And that was Immanuel's second school. The third school was built in 1912, that's the one that stands to this day, and we'll talk more about that later. After the congregation was established in 1862, there were huge problems between pastors and teachers. Back then, they would usually just have one teacher and one pastor, and it usually became a huge fight. And you'd think it was a fight over money. Well, there was not a fight over money because nobody had any money. These were German immigrants. It actually was a fight over theology. Whose theology was correct? Who was really reciting the Word of God? And unfortunately, because these men would come through and they would see a great opportunity for financial gain, even by doing unjust things or illegal things, both pastors and teachers, there were these great squabbles. The first pastor came then in 1862. He lasted for a short time. Then a second pastor came, and he lasted for a short time. But the hallmark pastor was a man by the name of J.H.C. Steege. And Pastor Steege arrived in 1870. And it was Pastor Steege for the next 47 years that not only kept Immanuel going, but growing. It was under his pastorate that the congregation built the church, built all of the different schools. And it was there that the congregation went to over 1,000 members. We'll talk more about that in a moment. I can't forget to tell you about an incredible man, though. His name was Taebel, Taebel. Teacher Taebel. He was not a pastor, he was a teacher. And after Immanuel's second pastor left, before Steege arrived, there was an interim. And Teacher Taebel was running the school. Now, why was he an incredible man? Here's why. Every day, Teacher Taebel would educate between 100 to 200 students a day. The big variety, most of this was farmland, and if the farmers needed their kids to stay and help at the farm on a particular day, they had to stay and they didn't get to go to school. But on any given day, it was between 100 and 200 students in the basement of a building. And it was done in 2 languages. He taught both in English and in German. If that wasn't enough, he was also the church organist. But many of the other worshiping communities didn't have organists, and so they would often borrow teacher Tabel to play the organ, especially at weddings and funerals and things like that. He also, during the vacancy, there was no pastor. He would go and he would visit the sick and the dying. He not only organized worship at Immanuel for every Sunday, but he often had to conduct worship, and he would borrow sermons from visiting Lutheran pastors that he would preach. Irma Dupree wrote a fabulous history book on Dundee. If you haven't had a chance to read it, it's still available. And Mrs. Dupree said this about Teacher Tabel. He also did an extraordinary service for many of the early pioneers, especially the poorer ones. The ones that came, mortality rate was very high, not only because health care was so limited, but the sanitary conditions were awful for these pioneers, as well as it was just a hard way of living. And so many of the pioneers died, and they had no money to have gravestones. And so Teacher Tabel, as a form of his ministry, would paint grave markers in exquisite handwriting, simply so that the graves of these pioneers who had passed away could be marked. Teacher Tabel lasted for a very number of years. He and Pastor Stege got along fabulously. Pastor Stege, after he arrived, he affectionately called his wife Mama. In fact, most of the congregational members called her Mama as well. Problem with Mama was she was a very sickly woman. And even though they were married for almost 60 years, through much of their 60 years, she spent either housebound, and for many of those housebound years, she was even bedridden. And so Pastor Stege not only had to take care of this growing congregation, but his beloved wife, he was caring for, nursing day after day. One of the other hardships they both had to face, they had 7 children. 4 of the 7 children preceded Pastor and Mama in death. And that means while he was pastoring, he had to bury 4 of his own children. I can't even imagine the grief he had to go through. The church was built in 1886. One of the problems with the church was this: they did not build or dig a basement. And so, when it became evident that a basement needed to be dug, you know why? Is because they were changing from outhouses to indoor plumbing. No longer did people want to go to church and use an outhouse. They wanted indoor plumbing. And so the congregation said, let's dig a basement so that we can put the bathroom in the basement where they thought properly a bathroom ought to go. Now, I don't know if you've looked at the structure of the original Immanuel, but it's monolithic. Yet these old Germans decided, let's dig a basement under an existing structure so that the women folk can have clean and safe toilet facilities, and that they could put in some kind of heating units. And so the women, they would set up open pit barbecues around the church, and the men came down with pickaxes and shovels and dug a basement underneath the church. When they widened 72 a number of years ago, my fervent prayer every day, dear God, don't let this church fall down. Because I was terrified that these old Germans didn't know what they were doing, and so they dug this basement, and now the foundation is going to be weak, and when they widen the road, I literally worried that the church would just slide over like a house built of cards. That these men would build this church and then dig a basement later. Incredible. And these weren't engineers. These weren't architectural geniuses. These were farmers and merchants and preachers and teachers and salesmen. And to this day, that church is still standing. During Pastor Stege's time, there was a number of controversies. One of the first controversies happened because of hymnals. Now, when the German immigrants came over from Germany, what they did is each of their German towns would have a printing press. And so each German town would print their own little hymnal. And the hymnals were a little bit bigger than a large index card, size-wise, and about 2 inches thick. And the men loved them because they would fit nicely into their coat pockets. At the turn of the century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, Concordia Publishing House, which is a Lutheran publishing house down in St. Louis, decided to put out a new hymnal. Now, the reason that was important was these old Germans, when they came over from Germany, they each had their own hymnal. But see, the pagination didn't match up from one village to another. They some had hymns, some didn't even have hymns. And so the pastor would say, find in your hymnal a mighty fortress, and we'll sing a mighty fortress. Well, some of the hymnals might not have had that particular hymn. And so Pastor Stiege, unilaterally, on his own, secured monies to buy the congregation hymnals. And so he ordered hymnals, and one Sunday, after that they had arrived, he had them placed in the church, and he got up and he said in front of the congregation, you no longer need to bring your own hymnals. We'll be using the hymnals. They have been purchased for us, and we'll enjoy them. People were so angry, so outraged, that very night, a riot, a mob, formed at the church, and then right next to the church, on the east side of the church, stood the parsonage where the pastor lived. It's now where we've added the addition, but there was a parsonage there, and the mob demanded the pastor to come out. They literally had already started heating up tar and had bags of feathers to show the pastor that if he made them use their hymnal, that new hymnal, they were going to tar and feather him and kick him out of Dundee. Fortunately, wisely, he relented and said they could still bring their hymnals, and then over time he used the hymnal over and over. You can see how important tradition has been in the history of our congregation. In 1909, another big controversy erupted. Over not far from where Otto's is now sat the Illinois Bolt Factory, ironworks and bolt factory. It was owned and operated by a German Lutheran by the name of Firk. And Firk was a very important man, not only in industry, but also in the church. And at that time, Pastor Stiege was the senior pastor, but an associate pastor had been called, and his name was Doderlein. Actually, they said Daderlein, but we call it Doderlein to this day. And Pastor Doderlein, the associate pastor, grew in prominence pretty fast, and by this time, Pastor Stiege was getting quite old. Hold on. Pastor Stiege was getting quite old, and so Pastor Doderlein was doing more and more of the administration. Mr. Firk got into a huge argument with Pastor Doderlein, and it was then Pastor Doderlein pulled his trump card and said, well, as long as you go to my church, you'll do as I say. And it was then Mr. Firk pulled his own trump card and said that I'll no longer go to your church. And Doderlein said, yeah, if you try to go to any other Lutheran church, I'll have you blackballed. It was then Mr. Firk decided to build his own church. And what he tried to do was to buy land that is exactly the same distance west of the Fox River as Immanuel was east of the Fox River. And so he built this beautiful church called Bethlehem, and it was his idea to name it Bethlehem because he believed he was starting all anew as Jesus when he started the New Testament. And so Bethlehem Lutheran Church, literally 2 or 3 baseball throws away from Immanuel, started because of a huge controversy. Now, Pastor Doderlein and Pastor Stiege weren't worried too much because they thought the people were very loyal to Immanuel. Nobody would end up going to Bethlehem. Well, Mr. Firk put up a sign in his factory. And he said, if you work in my factory, you will go to my church. And Bethlehem Lutheran overnight had 700 worshipers. At that time, that all was when the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod was trying to figure out its own identity. And so Immanuel was already a member of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Bethlehem Lutheran petitioned that they be part of the Missouri Synod as well. And Bethlehem said, if you're not going to let us, then we will find another Lutheran organization, or the Congregationalists would be glad to have us. The Missouri Synod realized quickly that they could lose an important congregation with important people, and so allowed them in, much to Pastor Steege's and Pastor Doderlein's dismay. It is for that reason we have two Lutheran churches of the same denomination so very close to each other. Here's the very good news. Over the years, the relations between the two churches started to warm up, and not only are they warm, we are incredibly collegial to this day and often help each other out when needs necessitate that. On just a side note, what's really interesting, it was Pastor Doderlein who got in the fight with Mr. Firk that caused Bethlehem to start, and my understanding now is most of the Doderlein clan are now all members over at Bethlehem. And I would just be interested somehow, some way, and if anybody knows the answer or which Doderlein to talk to on how that happened, that they ended up leaving Immanuel and going to Bethlehem, I would love to know that. Two other bits of note before we move on to our next part. In 1922, the steeple of Immanuel Lutheran Church was hit for the third time by lightning, and it came crashing down. It was at that time the church fathers and mothers decided we will no longer build the big steeple again. So the steeple we see right now that's over the treetops is literally a third as tall as it used to be. It used to soar even higher in the heavens. The word was that the Lutherans were afraid the Catholics were going to come in and build a church with a taller steeple. And so it was that reason the Lutherans first built the big tall steeple, thinking they wanted their church to be taller than if the Catholics came in. I've never measured, but I'm wondering at St. Catherine's, if it was the same elevation, which church would be taller? Maybe we should have some kind of a fundraiser to figure that out. Just kidding. Do that some other time. Last bit of note, in 1928, a significant thing happened in the life of Immanuel, and that was this. Up until that time, all worship, all classes, everything that was done was conducted in the German language. That means this: if you wanted to join Immanuel and you did not know German, the German language, even if you weren't German, you first would have to learn German so that they could teach you the catechism so that you could become a member. And interestingly enough, many people chose to do that. But in 1928, German became optional. No longer was the catechism exclusively taught in German, and it was Pastor Brauer who said we will start teaching confirmation classes in both languages so as not to be hindrance to the gospel, because less and less people that were coming into the church were German speaking. Now, it used to be the way they did evangelism was they would go down to where the pioneers were landing, like at the general store or at different train depots and things like that. And if you were German speaking, the pastor simply would say, "You're now a member of my church, come with me." Because remember, the Lutherans hung with the Lutherans, the Methodists hung with the Methodists, the Congregationals hung with their own. And so it was very, very segregated. And in 1928, they understood no longer was it going to be that way. Part 3, the formative years. A well in the wilderness, 1929 to 1958. It was in 1929 that a great pastor by the name of E.H.H. Gotti was installed at Immanuel. Pastor Gotti is the grandfather of our now present music director, Bill Gotti. And it was under Pastor Gotti and then his associate, a man by the name of Pastor Hoppel, that when I arrived here in 1994, many people would say, those were the golden years and we will never, ever see them again. And I was like, really? But I heard incredible stories of great leadership, great worship, great pastoral care, great education in the school, that indeed those were some of Immanuel's golden years. It was in 1939 that Sunday school first started at Immanuel. Up until that time, all of the education was done in the Christian day school. And why would we need to have a Sunday school when our kids are getting educated all the time during the regular day school? But as more and more people started to come, and actually they could not get into the day school because the day school was full. At that time, there were 4 classrooms, and each classroom had, between 50 to 75 students with one teacher, no aide. They simply had run out of room. As I said, this church school was built in 1912, and in 1912, the Immanuel Evangelical Lutheran School was known as the Pearl of Illinois. It became the model of education, not just for Lutheran schools, but for elementary schools everywhere. Originally, the top floor had a gymnasium and a theater, and there were classrooms below that. That all changed in the mid-50s. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But it was the Pearl of Illinois when it was built in 1912. One of the hallmarks of the ministry of Immanuel through its 152 plus years is this: Immanuel Evangelical Lutheran School. Not just the building, and now it's from 1912. It looks like it's from 1912, though it is very incredibly clean, updated, and still so very, very useful. That's still not the best part of the school, though. The best part has been the faculty, the men and women who have served there tirelessly over and over, who even today, in today's standards, if you teach at Immanuel Lutheran, you're going to make anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 less than you would make if you were in the public industry of education or other private schools. Incredibly dedicated people. The school was on the upswing, and so why have a Sunday school? But more and more of the students couldn't get into the school, so they started Sunday school in 1939. In 1946, what we take for granted today was groundbreaking, was revolutionary, was radical in its thinking of education. Immanuel Lutheran started a kindergarten. Now, the kindergarten was shoved into corners of the school. Not until 1955 did we have a kindergarten room. For 9 years, we shoved kindergartners around and just trying to help them get used to the idea of school. But that was radical thinking. In 1933, Adolf Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany. Many of the folks of the Dundee area saw Hitler as an incredible leader because he brought Germany out of their own depression. Started giving value back to the Deutschmark and put men back to work. And so before the war started, everybody thought Hitler was this great economic savior. Well, many of the Germans in Dundee, by the way, up through the early 30s, much of commerce done in East Dundee was done in the German language. Now, most folks spoke English, but if you spoke German, you often would do commerce in the German language in Dundee. As the war got closer, the FBI started targeting men and women and families in the Dundee, Fox Valley area that were of German descent and persuasion. Here's why. Many Germans, even though we're not known as a wealthy people, we were sending thousands of dollars over to Hitler in Germany to help out our family members, but also to elevate the economy. there was what was known as the German-American Bund of the Fox River Valley, and more money came from the German-American Bund in the Fox River Valley over to Germany than any other place in the country. Because we didn't know. We wanted to support the folks back home. The FBI came in and they particularly targeted those people who were ordering German newspapers. And some harassing would go on. Men would go out to get their newspaper, and an FBI agent would be standing there handing it to him, saying, "Do you really want to read this?" Pretty soon the harassment was able to stop, because more and more people stopped receiving the German language newspapers. After the war, there was a great sense of peace in our community. Though there was hostility toward German Americans, and I hope you know that. Certainly we know about Japanese Americans being put in internment camps, but many German Americans suffered at the hands of bigotry and prejudice as well, thinking that most of the German Americans here were spying for Hitler and for the Nazi regime. None of that, there's no evidence that any of that ever was true. Money was sent simply to encourage the economy and help the folks back home. But all of that happened before September 30th, 1939, when the outbreak of World War II happened. No money went over to Germany other than any that was stuffed in an envelope through the U.S. mail, but no money then was sent in large amounts after 1939 during the war years. After the war years, there was a great sense of peace among our village and community. Oh, this should be noted too. During the turn of the century, from the 1800s to 1900s, there were many Scots that lived in the area, and then the German immigrants came in, but the Scots, most of them, Presbyterian in nature, didn't like the German Lutherans, and so they decided they needed their own community, and it was then they crossed over into West Dundee, and that was known as the influential, the cosmopolitan, and we in East Dundee were the backwoods German Lutheran folks, and it was because the Scots didn't want to hang with us Germans. In 1955, I can't forget to tell you about this. In 1948, during this great time of peace, it was then Immanuel Lutheran did something radical that they'd never had done before either. During worship, before 1948, what would happen at the end of the service, the Eucharist would be celebrated, Christ's body and blood would be given. But here's how it worked. The men would first rise, and the men would first go to communion. And the way it worked is you would go on the left side of the church, or the east side of the church, and you literally could go through a door and you'd walk behind the altar then, and there were these little baskets known as clink beetles. And you had to pay an additional offering for your family's communion. And it was all, the men would go first because they would decide how much money they could pay and who in their family would get to commune, because you didn't want to cheat the Lord by having somebody go to communion and not pay for it. Not real good theology, but that was stewardship back then. But in 1948, it was then both Pastor Gotti and Pastor Hoppel decided it was time for men and women to go to communion together, and they could go as a family. And no longer was the clink beetle mandatory, it was optional. It's estimated between a quarter to a third of the congregation left and went elsewhere because they thought the congregation was going down the tubes. What manner of madness that men and women would now commune together! We rejoice in the fortitude and the vision of Pastor Gotti and Hoppel, that men and women, families, can come to the Lord's table together. The school needed to renovate. And it was then they put on a beautiful gymnasium that still is wonderful to this day. And it is then on the north end of the building, they put an extended room that was supposed to be temporary. It was only supposed to last about 5 or 6 years, and it was there they housed the kindergarten. To this day, it is still, after Mrs. Kohlert's long tenure, and now with Mrs. Anderson starting as our new kindergarten teacher, the kindergarten that was supposed to only last 5 years is still there to this day. The plans to renovate the school, the ones that we have now, call for knocking off that kindergarten room and T-boning a building that would be the same size as the existing old school from 1912. We would T-bone it right there. One of the reasons that a couple of reasons that we haven't done that yet. One is we renovated the church and we want to pay off the church before we do the school. The second reason is there is much fear it will cause a civil war if we tear off that building that so many of our kindergartners were first educated in. We're going to be creative. Maybe we'll save the brick. Maybe we'll save the plumbing and the electricity. I don't know, but we will make it as similar as we possibly can. Interestingly enough, in 1955, when they voted to do the renovation, the vote passed by 1 vote. Oh, you need to know this. It was only men that could vote back then. Women did not have the vote. And the vote came down. There were 99 people that showed up for the vote, and the vote won by 1. 45 to 44. Now here's what was amazing. The building was still erected in record time, done beautifully, because the 44 who voted against it recognized, even though they didn't win, they were part of a community of believers, and obviously God must have wanted it to be done, and so they chipped in too, even though it wasn't their side. We who live in a day of so much sectarianism, so much divisiveness, that if we don't get our way on a particular issue, we want to take our bat and ball and go home. We could learn a whole lot from those men and women from 1955. In 1958, two devastations happened to Immanuel Lutheran that many people thought would crumble the church. The first was this. Pastor Gotti passed away. He had been retired for about 1.5 years, and yet he was still a stalwart in the community and the area, but he died. And then Pastor Hoppel was alone. And then in 1958, 2 months after Pastor Gotti passed away, Pastor Hoppel received a call to be the secretary of the Northern Illinois District of our Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and he moved away to Hillside. And so Immanuel was left pastorless, and many thought the golden ages of Immanuel were done, gone, never to be seen again. God raised up an incredible man in 1959. And that brings me to part 4. I'm going to do the last 2 parts rather quickly. We call part 4 the strengthening years. God's presence in problems and in peace, 1959 to 1994. In 1959, Pastor Camp Hafner arrived, established his pastorate, did incredible things. In fact, his trademark was a black suit with a white shirt and a black tie. His neighbors would even say that when he mowed his lawn, he was in a black suit, white shirt, black tie, with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. During Pastor Camp Hafner's early tenure, we were bringing in students known as vicars, but that ended, and it was then a second pastor was called, and Pastor Ron Domer was called, and it was then the congregation made an incredibly unwise decision. And the unwise decision was this. No longer would they have a senior pastor. They decided that they would call 2 head pastors. They would have a 2-headed monster. They didn't realize it. Almost immediately, there was great acrimony between the 2 pastors, and it stemmed over housing. The red brick building right to the north, on the north side of Main Street, was the parsonage, and it's now an apartment building, or there's 2 or 3 flats in that building now. We don't own the building anymore. But at the time, it was the parsonage, and so they had to house Pastor Domer, and where our kindergarten stands now, there was a a small house known as the youth house, and they gave that to him. Well, there was not a lot of equity in the housing, and Pastor Domer raised a big stink. Also, Pastor Domer was angry that most of the weddings and funerals were being done by the senior pastor because he was the one that knew the people the longest and best. And so he mandated that it would be done 50-50. So many people would choose their wedding according to which pastor was going to be on duty that day. I think even some people tried to plan their funerals on which month they'd get the right pastor. I'm not sure they were so successful in that. One of the stories that came out of that is one of the pastors, during a heavy snowfall, climbed up on his roof. The way they solved the housing problem was they sold the parsonage and made both pastors go buy their own homes, and that seemed to take care of that. But later on, one of the pastors was on his own roof, and he was shoveling off snow. And as can happen sometimes, he fell off his roof, and he broke his leg. Was taken to the hospital and was going to be there for a while because he shattered his leg pretty good. The other pastor heard about it and refused to go visit him. It quickly became known throughout the whole congregation. Sadly, having this two-headed monster didn't work, and it got to a point where the pastors would not even speak to each other if any communication needed to happen. They would do it through notes and letters to each other. Pastor Kamphafner then retired, ended up coming out of retirement and serving St. Peter Lutheran Church in Gilbert's. That's another story for another time. Did great work over there. But Pastor Domer became the senior pastor. During that time, in 1974, the church was remodeled. There was this beautiful architecture around our altar, and it was all stripped away. And it's called the frontal that we have now is from 1974, and some would say that it was ruined. I think it's still beautiful. It's where a big cross is now erected, where there used to be the alpine wooden furnishings up front. Also, you could no longer go behind the altar, and so they had an altar rail that came out around, and so you just commune in front of the altar. You didn't walk through. At that time, also, an organ was commissioned, and by Dr. Thomas Gieshen, a professor at Concordia University in River Forest, and he not only designed but built the organ that is in our church to this day. Was installed in 1974. Another hallmark was up front above the altar were two round stained glass windows, beautiful stained glass. Well, they decided that at that time they wanted to put a whole new face, so they bricked up the stained glass. We ended up opening up those where they had bricked up the stained glass because we wanted the stained glass to come through, and that was back in 2005. And we were told that they bricked up the stained glass in the brick. That was part of the deal that the people who bricked it up. But when we opened it up, we found that the stained glass had been stolen. And so there's stained glass now. Miss Eileen Myers, when she passed away, left money for new stained glass windows there, but that's why they're stained glass. The original, we have no idea whatever happened. At the end of the 70s and 80s, there was a time of peace. Then Pastor Domer ended up moving away. And then at the end of the 80s, Pastor Jack Haino was called to serve as senior pastor. Pastor Haino had a successful ministry at the very get-go. He was a military chaplain and was very forthright in his doctrine, and yet his practice left some people very, very upset. A small group of people ended up siding with Pastor Haino, but a large group ended up being very disturbed, and many people left the congregation. And in fact, Pastor Haino was demoted from senior pastor to associate, and then he eventually ended up taking a call. Interestingly, what we found out is many people at that time refused to give money in their offerings. However, they wanted to set it aside for the Lord, so they took their offerings and they put them in bank accounts and figured when Pastor Haino was gone and there was a new regime, they would empty the bank accounts, and that's exactly what happened. In 1994, the church was flooded with money, even though there was less than 200 people coming on a weekend to worship. Pastor Haino ended up leaving in November of 1993. Our last part The looking forward years, living the legacy, leaving a legacy. In 1994, this trim, handsome, young Pastor William Yonker, who seems to be none of those anymore, arrived from Gloria Dei Lutheran Church. I had been serving a small congregation on the south side of Chicago over by Midway Airport. At the time I had the call here, I also had a call to be campus pastor at Concordia College, now it's university, in River Forest, Illinois. Unfortunately, President Lesh decided to take me out for lunch, and he told me, and he said, you can do what you want, but you need to go to Immanuel. And his exact words were this: these people have gone through some incredible hardships. What I want you to do is I want you to go, love them, give them Jesus, and I promise you, after 2 years, I will get you out of there. That was 1994. 20 years later, and President Lesh is now in heaven. I'm sure the promise has been forgotten. Early on, we renovated the church. We added, when I first came in 1994, we had an olive green carpeting that had been there since 1974. There were holes in the carpeting, but there was no money originally to pay for the holes in the carpeting, so we bought throw rugs to put over the holes in the carpeting. After the money came flooding in because of the people emptied their bank accounts, we then did a renovation on the inside of the church and got red carpeting and did red enhancements. We painted the church because there was smoke damage from the candles, and we were able to just upgrade things. At that time also, we added some outside, or didn't add, we tuck pointed some outside brickwork, and on the side steeples we found there are these big balls, and they're about 75 pounds each, and when we renovated that, the construction people said it's good we did that because the only thing that was holding those balls on the church was paint and gravity. If they'd have fallen and hit a car, somebody would have died. Thanks be to God, that did not happen. Some incredible people came through the doors of Immanuel. Pastor Les Messerschmidt briefly was with us until he passed away in 1996. Then we had two associate pastors, Pastor Schwichtenberg and Pastor Seidler, both incredible preachers, came through. Problem at this point was we couldn't keep a principal. Our principals were rotating through, even though we had an incredible faculty and staff. In the year 2000, we added a new music program with Mr. Gotti, Mrs. Bartelt. In 2001, we got an incredible man as our principal, Ken Becker. And then it was a year after that, we got our third pastor there, the young, handsome, esteemed Pastor Meisner. He's none of those three. No, he's still esteemed. We also added Pastor Bogens, Pastor Bowen, and Dave Meyer became our DCE. In 2003, we renovated the church. Two notable things about that: the brick that we used on the renovation of the church was made by the same brick maker as the original brick maker, Hager Pottery. And so we were able to use the same brick maker for 1886 as well as 2003 edition. Here's why we didn't have to worry about the church falling down, though, is when we added the addition, we found out most foundations are 12 to 14 inches thick. When the Germans built the church in 1886, they brought in these big boulders from the Miller farm over off of Randall Road, and the foundation in some areas was 6 to 8 feet thick of rock. The church would not fall down. One time I came over when they were digging the hole for the addition, and I heard all this cussing and swearing, and I came over, I said, fellas, this is a church, what are you doing? And they looked at me, they called me Padre. They said, oh, sorry, Padre, but we got to cut through 6 feet of rock. You can understand why we would swear. I gave him forgiveness immediately. David Schilt, our architect, actually won 2 international awards on the renovation, and the awards stand in our church to this day. In 2006, we got an incredible man serving with me. His name is Pastor Phil Beowulf. Came at the end of 2006, started beginning of 2007. In 2010, Immanuel's ministry changed again. We hired for the first time a business manager, property manager, Chris Wendt, who's been a member of his congregation all his life. After that, Mrs. Hines became our admissions director, and Mrs. Domeyer became our principal. Incredible women. And that leads us up to today. Deutsche Fest. The history of Immanuel in 1 hour, 152 years. Thank you for paying attention.